Hey everyone, Brittany here from By Brittany Goldwyn, a blog about DIY and houseplants. And today I'm back with another plant care guide with my assistant here, Blanche, who decided as soon as I sat down she wanted to sit on my lap. Today Blanche and I will be telling you about the monstera dubia that you see right here. So first I will be talking about light soil and water, the basic things. Then I will cover temperature and humidity. We will cover whether or not this plant is pet safe. And we'll talk about propagation and where you might find this plant. And I might sprinkle in a couple other things throughout the video. So first, let's talk about light for this plant. This plant likes bright indirect light. Like a lot of plants where this plant comes from, it grows under a dense canopy of trees in its natural habitat. So it's best to replicate that if you can in your home. I have mine on a shelf in front of a very sunny window that gets bright indirect light from probably about noon on to very early or very late evening in the summer. You can supplement with a grow light if you'd like. When I had this plant, it was about this tall when I first got it, and I actually had it in my greenhouse cabinet under a grow light because it was the middle of winter when I got it, and it was happy in those conditions as well. As far as water and soil for this plant go, I typically let this plant dry out almost completely before watering it again. I know that a lot of people say that you should let the top few inches of soil dry out before watering it again. I'd say I let probably about the top half of the soil dry out before I water it again. When I do water it, I'll show you here, gently take it out here. I actually have it on this giant plank in a plastic nursery pot that has a bunch of drainage holes on the bottom. So I like to just take it over to the sink and hose down all of the foliage, trying to get behind the leaves if I can, and give it a good thorough drink, letting all of the excess water drain out of the bottom of the drainage holes. And then I don't water it again until that top half of soil dries out. You can use a moisture meter. I typically just use my finger. For the soil, as you can see here, I have it in a really chunky soil mix. You can use any houseplant or indoor potting soil. It will probably work just fine. I typically throw in a few extra chunks of either orchid bark or coconut husks, and a really perlite heavy mix is great for this plant as well. I'm trying not to use peat moss, so although a lot of the soil mixes I buy come pre-mixed with peat moss in them, if I'm making my own mixture at home, I will substitute coco coir for peat moss just because it is more sustainable than peat moss is. So I'll typically mix in some of that to help with moisture retention without the soil making the soil too heavy. As far as temperature and humidity for this plant, I have found this plant to be extremely flexible with temperature and humidity requirements in different areas of my home. I was a little bit worried that this one would require higher humidity levels, but that hasn't really been the case. I've been getting some amazing growth on my plant, just having it in my home in a room that gets great light and does not have a humidifier. Now, granted, it is very humid in the summer where I live, and that, despite having central air, does kind of creep into the house as well. So that could be helping with its growth, but I did not and have not ever moved this plant outside for the summer to give it that humidity jumpstart that I do with a lot of my house plants since we have such warm and humid weather here in Maryland. These are tropical plants, so they are not cold or frost hardy if you do bring them outside. However, they're typically happy in a wide variety of normal household temperatures. We keep our house pretty cool in the winter, and we don't let it get super hot in the summer, but I would say I keep it a little bit higher than average. So anywhere in the 70s and 80s or lower 90s Fahrenheit is probably going to be fine for this plant. As far as the toxicity of this plant, this is not a pet safe plant. You may be wondering why I have a cat on my lap. It's safe for pets to be around it. They just can't ingest it. Humans should not ingest it either. It can just lead to a variety of different GI issues. So I would recommend keeping it away from your pets if they are nibblers. This one does not have any teeth and she is not interested in plants at all. And I keep this up and away from her on a shelf that she doesn't really go to anyway. So keep that in mind if you're looking to add any sort of monstera plant to your houseplant collection. Now you can see that this plant has a very unique shingling-like growth pattern. When I first got it, it came on a board that only came up to about here. So I added the smaller board that you can see under here. You can see these are actually two separate boards. And once it had outgrown that board, I just ended up repotting it and sticking this wider board. This is just a board that I got from Lowe's in the hobby board section. It's a poplar board. I did not finish it or seal it or anything. Stuck it down in the soil, packed it down as tightly as I could. And then I used rubber bands on here to encourage the plant to grab on to the wood as it's climbing. So as you can see, when I added this bigger board, the leaf size just shot up. I mean, this is all from about here up is all growth from, let's see, I'm filming this in mid-September, all growth from probably like mid-June when I repotted it and added a new board. So this has been pretty exciting. The board is so high it's out of frame and it looks kind of silly now, but I didn't want to have to repot the plant next spring. I want to be able to keep it in this pot for another year and hopefully not have to add another board. I will kick that can down the road and figure out what I'm going to do when it gets that tall. One option you have for when your plant does outgrow the board is you can just snip it and propagate it. And it's very simple to propagate these plants. You want to look for a growth point on the stem, and I would recommend rooting this one in a damp moss and perlite mixture. Any sort of plant propagation box or just throwing a Ziploc bag over top of the cutting and the moss mixture will be great. I have a guide all about sphagnum moss propagation on my blog if you're interested in learning more about that if you've never done it before. If you do not add a board like this, the growth will get really long and leggy and the leaves will just be super tiny and sad looking. So I took a couple pictures of some of these plants in my local nursery that have outgrown their boards and they're just looking super sad. So in that case, I would trim that off and I would try and propagate it because you can always grow a new plant, a new baby plant from it, and they will eventually get large, lovely leaves like these. This only has a plant on one side, but as you can see, it's sprouted some growth here that I am just starting to train to wrap around. This one here is new growth, and this one here I'm starting to train to wrap around. So once these get like one more leaf on here, I'll probably add another rubber band just to make sure that those aerial roots are getting connection with the board so that it can grab onto them. And when you water your plant and you rinse it, and humidity also helps with encouraging the plant to grab onto the board. You might also notice that when the new growth comes out on the top of your plant, it's almost translucent and the leaves look a little smaller. All of these leaves came out looking pretty small, and they eventually, as they hardened off, the color deepened, the contrast increased on them, and the leaves got larger to be their final size here. So don't be alarmed if your new growth looks a little sad at first. It can sometimes take, in my experience at least, about a month for them to reach their fullest potential. So if you're interested in where to find this plant, I found this at a nursery about an hour away from my house. I got it for an amazing price. It was like 30 bucks, which is way lower than I see them around here. Just earlier today, I was at a local nursery and I saw some that like kind of looked a little sad, honestly. And they were for sale for $50, which is a little bit lower than I've seen them for sale for in the past. If you don't have any independently owned nurseries that specialize in more rare tropicals, then you can always check online. I've ordered a lot of plants from Etsy. I like to support the small sellers on there. Just make sure you read the reviews before you order anything to make sure that what you're getting is legit and it's going to be packaged well and arrive to you. And don't do it in the winter. That about wraps up our care video for the Monstera dubia. It is such a cool conversation plant. It's a great one to add to your collection. I found it to be pretty easy to grow despite being a really cool and unique plant. If you liked this plant care video, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you can see all of my other plant care videos. And I also have an in-depth guide, care guide and propagation guide on my blog by brittanygoldman.com that I'll link here if you're interested in reading more about this and seeing a bunch of detailed pictures of the growth patterns and how to propagate this plant and what that process looks like. So until next time, happy planting.